up his affairs and to do all of the heavy lifting. The house was full of furniture and junk that the old lad had collected in his 81 years, so Kev's van came in very handy. And whilst in the house, Kev was not reluctant to air his feelings about a man he'd only met on half a dozen occasions. "I hated the old bastard," he said. "He was a nasty, nasty bit of work." It was his girlfriend's mum's brother, but even she had to admit that he'd not been a pleasant man. And at that moment, a mirror resting on top of a chest of drawers fell to the ground, smashing into glistening slivers across the worn-patterned carpet. They both began to pick up the bits and scrape them onto a grey plastic dustpan, and just as he crouched down, Kev was nudged, and on putting out his hand to stop himself from falling, a long shard of mirror pierced his skin, pushing deeply into the soft skin between his thumb and forefinger. Blood spurted out across the floor, and he quickly jerked out the glass, and his hand bled even more. "Hey, you pushed me," he barked at Jan's mum. "I didn't," she replied. "I was putting the glass in the bin." She was 20 feet away. It must have been his imagination. And as he found a big sticking plaster, he chuckled, "You don't think the old bugger's ghost's out to get me, do you?" 3 hours later, a skip was full. Batches of furniture had been taken to a local second-hand shop, and a few of the nicer things remained to circulate around the family. A chest of drawers, a kitchen table and chairs, dozens of boxes of ornaments, pictures, and an old-fashioned bed. "Are you sure you don't mind us having the bed?" said Kev. "Just ours is knackered, and at the minute we can't afford to buy a new one. I'd rather you two made use of it rather than going for a fiver from the shop. Have it as a present from your uncle." And the mother-in-law was just trying to help them out, so Kev dropped her off at home with most of the stuff, locked up the house in readiness for it to be sold, and conveyed his new bed back home. It took a major domestic reorganisation to get the bed into their biggest bedroom, but it did look amazing. Jan was thrilled and put on their best bedding set, dumping the old cheap one in the yard for the council to get rid of. A new bed, a little money from the late uncle, and Christmas on its way. Things were pretty good. Until later that night, when they were both lying in their newly acquired nest, surrounded by crisply washed sheets, when they heard a noise from downstairs and a smell of smoke. Kev raced down to find the Christmas tree had tipped over, and the lights, even though switched off at the wall, had shorted. He stood the tree up, unplugged the lights, squirted some air freshener, and plodded back up to bed. 10 minutes later, Jan said, "Don't do that." Kev had been sound asleep, and he said, "What?" Jan told him that he'd been blowing in her ear and that his breath was stinking. Still shell-shocked, Kev told her that he hadn't blown in her ear and he'd just cleaned his teeth. He breathed on her and she confirmed a minty smell. She knew that something was wrong, but eventually just drifted back to sleep. As they lay there, the quilt was pulled off them both. And the following morning, whilst Jan made some toast, she said, "When you got up during the night, you shouldn't have taken the quilt with you. I found it out on the landing." Kev had no idea what she was talking about. She had retrieved it and had covered him up by the time he'd woke up. And suddenly the television switched on in the living room, blasting out on full volume. Kev presumed he'd sat on the remote control, but couldn't find it when he looked to switch it off, eventually knocking it off at the set. And on getting upstairs, all of the drawers to the chest of drawers and the wardrobes were open. Messy cow, he thought, and closed them. He grabbed his jacket, he headed out to work. Jan left 5 minutes later. At around 10 minutes to midday, they both received phone calls from a neighbour to say that she'd just called the police because there was someone in their house. They both explained to their bosses and raced back home. And on getting to the front door, their motion sensor burglar alarm was wailing, yet the front door was still locked. The police were there and had looked into the backyard. There were no signs of forced entry, yet on getting into the house, all the lights were on. The radio was playing in the bedroom. Furniture in the living room was tipped over. The microwave was working, although there was nothing in there, and there was a disgusting smell everywhere. It was the smell of rotting flesh, and it was so bad, One of the police officers said to his colleague, "I think there might be a body here." After a thorough check of the house, the police left, giving them a crime number for the criminal damage. They spent the rest of the afternoon putting everything back where it had been before they left. And despite a couple of scented candles and a complete can of air freshener, the smell was still vile. That night they sorted through cupboards, plug holes, drains, searching for the source without success. Jan went upstairs, was getting ready for bed. She was in the bedroom just in her pants, looking in the wardrobe for a nightie, when she noticed something in the mirror on the door. There was someone standing behind her. She screamed and spun around, and something black seemed to dart swiftly out of the door. "Quick, he's going down the stairs!" Kev was actually at the top of the stairs at the time, and something hit him in the chest, almost knocking him down. Winded and breathing heavily, he rushed into the bedroom, his face white with fear. "Shit, we've got a ghost." Jan had never believed in them, but it was the only thing that made sense. She rang Night Owls to talk to me on the radio, and within 24 hours had a priest in there to give her a blessing. Things calmed down. Normality returned until one day during breakfast, Kev was chatting about how terrified they'd been and said, "I always hated that uncle of yours. It was probably him." And at that very second, there was a huge bang from the bedroom above their heads. They both stopped dead. It started again. On getting upstairs, they couldn't get into the room as the wardrobe had fallen onto the bed, blocking it. Jan was now too scared to look into any mirrors, for every time she did, she saw things moving, shapes, and in particular, a man staring out at her. Nothing normal can tip over a wardrobe full of clothes that's been standing there for years without a problem. It would take sheer brute force. Later that night, things moved to a whole new level. Jan was off work, so watched some television, and Kev phoned to say that he was invited to a leaving do and wouldn't be back till about 11 o'clock. So she went to bed early to read a magazine and listen to the radio. She was a little tired, and suddenly there was a little interference and the radio went off. The only light in the room was a bedside light, so she put one leg out of the bed when something pushed her back onto it. She was being pushed down into the bed. She could feel hands grasping her arms and a man's body rubbing itself against her bottom. This was solid. It was real. It had to be a burglar. Good God, she was going to be raped. She screamed and screamed and screamed until her neighbour began hammering on the front door. All the while, Jan was held down tightly and felt her legs being dragged off the bed. She hit the floor with so much force, she was knocked out. Her neighbour had a spare key, and along with her husband, they ran upstairs to find her on the bedroom floor, bleeding. As she called for an ambulance, her husband looked around for the intruder. None was found. The ambulance took her to hospital, where they confirmed a sexual assault had taken place. Photographs were taken of her thighs, where there were actual handprints. Both of her forearms had huge black and purple bruises, as if she'd been held against her will. She needed 8 stitches in a head wound and had internal injuries, as if something had been placed inside her. When Kev returned home, there was a policeman waiting for him at the door. He explained that Jan was in hospital and that he'd not been able to get anything from the old man. "What old man?" said Kev. "You mean Jack from next door?" The young policeman said that the neighbours were at the hospital with a girlfriend. "No, the old gentleman up in the bedroom, he just stares out the window. Does he have Alzheimer's? He refused to say anything to me, and I might have taken him into custody. He was the only other person in the house when she was attacked." In a rage, Kev bounded upstairs, closely followed by the policeman, and burst into the bedroom and saw Jan's uncle smiling at him from the mirror in the wardrobe. The policeman saw him too and looked into the opposite corner, the area where the mirror seemed to reflect. And just then, the reflection just disappeared.